Welcome to the After On podcast. I'm your host, Rob Reed, and this is a series of conversations with thinkers, founders, and scientists. Take a little time and stretch out, because these talks are unhurried and meant to bring you to a top percentile understanding of something important. So, whether you're into startups or ideas, a techie or a lit major, take your time, engage your mind, and you'll be glad you did it. Especially this week, when we'll be talking to
Yale University psychology professor Laurie Santos. Laurie's early academic work was on animal cognition, with a focus on monkeys and dogs. But she's now also becoming a major force in positive psychology, which is the science of something we're all interested in, happiness. Earlier this year, Laurie launched her first course on happiness at Yale, basically as an experiment. To her astonishment, it became the single most popular class in the university's 317-year history. Fully a quarter of the school took it. The next thing she knew, she was on the Today Show. The New Yorker and the New York Times were writing about her class. The equivalents of the New York Times in many foreign countries were covering it. In short, it was pretty clear that she was onto something big. If you're new to this show, welcome. It features in-depth conversations with world-class experts about their domains of knowledge. In each episode, I try to bring you, and myself, a serious grounding in something complex and important that we should all probably understand a bit better. If you enjoy this episode, please browse the show's archives at after-on.com or in your favorite podcasting app. You'll find an archive of fascinating conversations with some of the world's top people in robotics, neuroscience, cryptography, drones, augmented reality, synthetic biology, and many other fields. If you're interested in these sorts of things, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the show. In today's interview, we're going to start by learning how the brains and thinking of monkeys and dogs differ from our own. Since Laurie runs a dog-friendly shop, my own little dog Ashby came along for the interview, as you'll hear, which was a first for this program. The second and larger part of the interview focuses on the fascinating science of happiness. There's a crisis of misery brewing on American campuses and beyond them as well. Laurie's frontline exposure to this, plus some really jarring statistical research that she learned about, which we'll discuss, propelled her to develop her course. Our interview is a bit of a crash version of that course in that we'll review her key findings and lessons, as well as many of the techniques that neuroscientists, neuropsychologists, and others have honed to, quite effectively, increase happiness levels in those who practice them. I should stress that none of this is hokey self-help gimmickry. It all stems from meticulous research that's been done at top universities throughout the world and published in academic journals. My interview with Laurie turned into a wonderfully expansive conversation. So as I sometimes do with extra long interviews, I'm publishing an abridged version to the main podcast feed out of respect for the time of my more casual listeners. That's particularly appropriate with this episode because something called time affluence can be critical to happiness, as we'll soon learn. I'll meanwhile post an extended version of the interview, the director's cut, if you will, to my Patreon feed, which is at patreon.com/RobReed. There, it will be seamlessly available to those who support this show with monthly contributions of $5 or more. I'll talk more about Patreon in my comments after the end of the show. And please do stick around for that closing segment, because I'll also tell you more about this series of articles I'm posting to medium.com this month. It's about the things I believe we humans need to do to survive some huge dangers that technology is likely to present in this truly exciting and blessed, but also very fraught century. Finally, I'd like to dedicate this episode to the memory of my father, who passed away in the short span of time since I recorded today's interview. It's an appropriate interview to acknowledge him in, not only because of the timing, but because he was a happy man and contributed hugely to the happiness of myself, my family, and countless other people. Rest in peace, Dad. We all miss you. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for having me in this incredible home of yours at Silliman College. For folks who don't know what the college system is here at Yale, I'd love it if you could just give a quick rundown of what Silliman College is and why you have this incredibly cool house.
Yeah. So Silliman College is one of the 14 residential colleges here at Yale. Yale's kind of like Hogwarts and Harry Potter, where it has Gryffindor and Hufflepuff and so on. We have 14 of those, and that means the students live in a particular college all 4 years of their time at Yale. And each college is its own microcosm of the Yale community. We have our own programming, our own dean, our own head of college, which is what I am. The head of college controls programming. We're kind of like the CEO of the college, somewhere between the CEO and a beloved aunt to the students. But that means I live on campus in a very big house in which I do lots of programming and events. Later this afternoon, we have a Silliman College tea, which is kind of like a fireside chat with these important folks. And it's really fun.
So now, just going briefly through your early background, on a certain level, your career is incredibly linear in that you were at Harvard from freshman year clear through to your PhD. And then 15 years ago, you came to Yale, and here you still are. But linear as that is, there's this charming story you shared with me earlier that basically the butterfly flapping its wings, that small random event, which arguably put this high momentum process in motion, was this rather charming misunderstanding you had about what office hours were at the beginning of your freshman year. And I'd love if we could just start with that tale.
So I grew up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and went to this really big urban public high school. Most of the students in New Bedford High don't go to college at all, let alone a place like Harvard. So I was pretty underprepared for all kinds of things. One of which was what an office hour was. I thought it was some hour that you had to get through with the professor to pass the course or something.
It's like mandatory.
Yeah.
You had to show up at least one time during the semester.
1 hour.
Log that hour.
And so I, being the very keen first-year student that I was like, I'm going to get this hour out of the way really early on. And so with all of my professors that fall, I made really early office hour appointments with folks. One of them was the cognitive neuroscientist, Steve Koslin, who at the time was a professor at Harvard. He was my introduction to psychology professor. And so I met with him, and I think he went through the statistics of why students typically want to meet. It was too early in the semester to complain about a grade, so it was probably about a position working in his lab. And so he proposed so you want to work in my lab? And I was like, oh, that sounds great.
And you became a professor of cognitive psychology. Just to contextualize things, how does that differ from developmental psychology, behavioral, abnormal?
So cognitive psychology is really the science of how people think, science of how we make sense of the world, how we perceive, how we make decisions, how we remember things. Functionally, what we're trying to do is to figure out the representations of the world that make up these choices, that make up these algorithms that people use. So cognitive psychologists sometimes study things like perception, how you perceive the world. They sometimes study things like the nature of thought. That was what Steve Koslin mostly studied. He was really interested in the nature of mental imagery, like how we can see images in our minds and how we use those to make decisions and so on. Things like memory and even things like decision-making, how we perceive the world and we get some information, how do we end up making decisions?
And then you graduated fairly quickly to working with animals as a research assistant, correct?
Yeah.
Was this in your sophomore year or something like that?
Yeah, it was my sophomore year, and it came out of a certain frustration I had as a freshman undergrad working with human subjects, because human subjects have some idea about what the study is, and animals don't. We were doing studies related to implicit memory. Your brain is picking up on certain associations in the world. You're not trying to remember explicitly. This information just kind of gets in there. But the problem with implicit memory is that if you're trying to remember something, your implicit memory system doesn't kick in. It only works if you don't notice that you're picking up on some information.
It's like trying very hard to fall asleep.
Yes, exactly. And so we would bring subjects in for these studies, keeping very cryptic the fact that it was an implicit memory study. But they were students from the Introduction to Psychology class who just learned about implicit memory and how you test it. And we'd run our whole study. And at the end, we'd debrief subjects and we'd ask, what do you think the study was about? And they'd be like, it was an implicit memory study. And then we'd have to toss them out of the experiment. And this was incredibly frustrating. It was like, oh, these people, they know too much. It was around this time that I took a version of the class that I now teach at Yale. And it was all about evolutionary psychology. What is the evolutionary history of the mind? And a prime way that you study those questions is you try to say, how do animals think about the world? And what can we learn about our own evolutionary history from that? And the professor who was teaching the class put up wonderful pictures of his field site, this island of Cayo Santiago, right off the coast of Puerto Rico, which is home to about 1,000 free-ranging monkeys. And he showed pictures of his research assistants doing studies on this beautiful Puerto Rican island. And I said,
with monkeys.
With monkeys. And I was like, I could not be in this terrible lab in the psychology building. I could be out on this island in Puerto Rico. So that was one of my reasons for switching to the animals, was a frustration with human research. But also it was this moment where I really realized how exciting these questions in evolutionary cognition could be. When you're down at the field site, you interact with these monkeys, and they're amazingly social, really political. They're doing their monkey thing, trying to navigate who likes who and how I can get access to these resources.
And their political cliques, do they extend throughout the entire community of 1,000 monkeys, or are they more localized? Do they have sort of bands that they associate with and politic within?
Yeah, so on the island, there's between 5 and 6 groups at various times that I've been down there. And those groups are based on a matriline. So they're on the female side, it's mostly based on who you're related to. But on the male side, it's really who your connections are. Within group, they're incredibly political. Between groups, you see this incredible xenophobia, almost warlike behavior between the different groups of monkeys. And it was all these things together that got me so interested in studying the evolution of human cognition. Because on the one hand, these creatures are so like human. They're navigating all the same problems that we navigate socially, but they're doing it with none of the same tools that we have. They don't have language. They don't have iPhones. They don't have a culture that tells them how to solve these problems from hundreds of years ago. They're kind of figuring it out all on their own.
Yeah, it's a much purer experience with the problems that we face because you're not standing on the shoulders as much of the people who've gone before and said, this is how you get through 4th grade. They all have to do it on their own. They got to do it without language.
That's correct.
Yet they have a lot of the same cognitive apparatus that we do. Now, one of the things that you became interested in very early is theory of mind. And initially, you started studying how that differs between us and monkeys, and you later got into how that differs between us and dogs, which is a topic that's very interesting to me, is my little dog, Ashby, who is attending her first interview of mine, by the way.
Oh, that's great. She heard you say dog and ran over
she
as
heard
soon
me
as she
say
did.
dog.
Yeah.
No, I think she heard me say theory of mind. She's very interested in theory of mind herself. But what have you learned thus far about the theory of mind that a monkey might hold, and how does that differ from us?
So first, let me clarify what this term theory of mind is, which is a little bit of a weird term. So theory of mind just refers to the ability that we have to think about what's going on inside someone else's head. And it's one of the many abilities that is just computationally incredibly hard, so really hard to program some robot or something to do, that we just find so fluid and easy, we forget how complicated it really is. And so as you're looking at me right now, you're watching my behavior. I'm looking at Ashby, our cute dog, who's attending this interview session, and you're paying attention to where my eyes are pointing, how I'm behaving. But you go beyond just looking at my behavior to thinking about what's going on inside my head. You understand that I have the intent to interact with Ashby, that I know that she's in the room. I have some beliefs about that she's a dog and that she will like it when I pet her and so on. And that's amazing because it means you're simulating the things that are inside my head. None of that comes from my behavior. My behavior is just where I'm looking and how I'm interacting. And the reason theory of mind is called a theory is in part because what we're doing is theorizing. We don't have any direct evidence for things like intentions and beliefs and desires, but we simulate them really easily. And there's been this long-standing question about whether any nonverbal creature can do that. If you think about how you know about beliefs and desires and intentions, it might just be because you hear about them in discourse. That's how people talk about how other people are thinking. And so there's been a long-standing question about whether or not any other animals can do that. The first paper on this was back in 1978 when the primatologist David Premack asked, does the chimpanzee have a theory of mind? He did what was a very famous study that now isn't thought of as great evidence for having theory of mind. He showed his very language-trained chimpanzee, Sarah, a bunch of different scenarios. So Sarah was faced with pictures of a person who had lots of water on the floor, a picture of a person who was caught inside a cage or an enclosure. And then Sarah had to pick from another set of images something that would help that person out. So a key in the case of a person who's trapped in a cage, or the faucet in the case of a person who's seeing water all over the floor and so on. And famously, Sarah was able to do that. She was a very smart chimpanzee who was really well trained. And this launched this whole argument about, does that really count as good evidence that you can represent somebody's mind? You know, maybe she just saw a key associated with
keys
a cage.
Open cages.
Right,
might
exactly.
be all that she was thinking, and faucets have to do with water.
Exactly. And so this launched this big debate about, well, what really could count as evidence? Not that you're thinking about behavior, but you're really doing this theorizing. You're theorizing about things inside someone's head. And what researchers came up with was the classic case of having a false belief. So imagine we're sitting in New Haven and it's very nice out, but imagine I had the false belief that it was raining out. You might expect me to behave in ways that didn't really match what was going on in reality. I would put my galoshes on and I would grab an umbrella and so on. The only way you could explain my behavior, given that it's perfectly nice out in New Haven right now, is to think about this thing in my head, to realize I falsely believe this thing that's different from reality and different from what you think.
So by watching you, I would infer that, oh my God, Laurie totally thinks it's raining out.
Mm-hmm.
She just grabbed the umbrella. She doesn't know, etc. And so that's the
Exactly.
inhabiting or modeling of your mind inside of mine, which is computationally very expensive.
Super expensive, in part because you don't want to get confused. You don't want to think it's raining out just because I'm wrong. You don't want to have a false impression of reality. You don't want to mess up what's really happening out there in the world. And that means we have to simultaneously hold on to what we think is true at the same time as we're thinking about what other people might falsely think is true.
Most comedy would be impossible without theory of mind.
Yeah, and major plots in Shakespeare plays and so on that Romeo doesn't know that Juliet thinks. And so we do it so easily that we forget how powerful it is. But if somebody understands a false belief, the only way they could do that is if they're really simulating something inside the head. They can't just be doing it off behavior. So this became a classic litmus test for whether or not a creature had a theory of mind.
And how did you test that in monkeys?
We ask about their expectations through what they look at.
Mm-hmm.
And the logic here is that if something violates your expectations, if I just did something completely weird, you might stare at me more than if I was just doing something normal in this interview. And long-standing research has shown that monkeys will look longer at things that violate their expectations.
And babies too, right?
Yeah, this is another technique that researchers who study human infants use as well, where you show baby these little social scenarios and you give them different outcomes, some of which are surprising, some of which should violate your expectations. And you can see whether or not babies have the same expectations by seeing how long babies look at things.
And that's nice because you can quantify that very clearly over many, many trials and across different individuals. You can say, well, this one normally looks for a quarter of a second, but boom, this thing was a half second. And that's how you start zeroing in on whether they have a theory of mind about the way somebody else is behaving.
That's correct. So imagine a scenario where I hide the microphone in one location and I leave the room and I come back and I look in that location. That's super boring, right? Because you know that I know where it is. But imagine I hide the microphone in one location, I come back into the room and I search for it in a cupboard. I search in a completely different location for this microphone. You would find that very strange. You're like, well, she saw where it was. What's her problem? And that moment where you're like, hey, what's going on? That would probably increase your looking. That would be the moment that your expectation about what I was about to do was violated.
So when the monkey would see the person who was testing them do something that was strange based on what the monkey thought that person knew.
Correct.
The monkey would stare for that extra quarter second or whatever it was. And through lots of interactions like that, the theory arose that monkeys do in fact have a theory of mind.
Yeah. And so the simple scenario we put monkeys in had monkeys watching a human who had two little boxes where she could hide food, say A or B. And as the person hides food in box A, she then goes to look for the food and she either looks in box A or looks in box B. And what we find is that the monkeys are pretty surprised when the person looks in box B. If she thought the food was in A, she should look in A for the food. Monkeys have this expectation, which is kind of a bit of theory of mind. They seem to know what it means for somebody to know something.
Yeah.
The false belief case comes in when we up the ante and make the monkey think something about the world that the person in the scenario doesn't think. And here's how we do that. We have the monkey watch as the person puts food into box A. Person then turns around and is not paying attention, and suddenly the food rolls from box A to box B. So the monkey sees this. The monkey's like, oh, it's not in A anymore.
I know that, but she doesn't know that.
Exactly. And so that's the question. If a human watched this, the human would expect that when the person turns around, she'll continue searching in box A because she falsely believes that it's there. This is a very easy, simple prediction for adult humans to make. What we find, though, is that as soon as the person has the false belief, the monkeys don't make any prediction anymore. They seem to realize that she doesn't have information about where the food is, but they don't seem to use that to simulate this whole other world where she thinks it's in this false location.
So there's limits to it, and that's the cusp of where we differ, is this ability to not create fictional worlds.
That's right. And it seems like non-human primates in particular can make predictions about what a person knows and maybe a little bit what they might be ignorant about, what information they don't have, but they can't simulate, well, in her head, it must be in box A. And it's hard for us to even think about because it's something we do so fundamentally. We just like simulate what I must be thinking or what someone else must be thinking and so on. But it maps onto these other things that we don't think animals do very well. We don't think animals are very good at simulating these fictional worlds, right? The reason I can think about Harry Potter and what it's like for Harry Potter to live in Gryffindor, even though I live in Silliman, is because it's really easy for me to simulate thoughts in Harry Potter's head. Non-human animals just seem not to be able to do this.
Yeah. Maybe that's where all of our superpowers lie, as well as a lot of our neuroses. Now that you pivoted to focusing more on dogs a few years ago, and that was partly financial because dogs are free. People like me will bring you their dog because they think, I know I have the smartest
we
dog.
We just didn't have any openings for
I
Ashby
know.
today.
She wanted to be a doggy tourist at the lab. But people will bring in their dogs because some people think erroneously that their dog is the smartest in the world. They're wrong because mine is the smartest in the world. But you can have people from the community bring dogs in. And also, you had a facility here in addition to going to Puerto Rico.
That's right. And those monkeys have moved to Franklin and Marshall College, where they're part of their animal behavior program. Yeah. And it's tricky. I mean, primates are social animals, and you want to house them in really large facilities where they can live with their groups and have normal social behavior. And that's expensive in terms of resources and expensive in terms of university property and so on. So that was part of the reason. But a more conceptual reason was that lots of work was coming out suggesting that one of the things that makes our mind special is the fact that we can stand on the shoulder of giants, right? We really can learn culturally about what to do, specifically learning from other people. And for the most part, primates, even though they're our closest living relatives, they kind of just don't do that. You see relatively little teaching in primates, so little transmission across generations. And even when they have the opportunity to learn from humans in these social learning studies, they kind of don't learn as much. And that suggested that we were missing out on one route to the kinds of cool things that humans do that come from just being motivated to pay attention to what others are teaching you and so on. So primates are bad at that, but dogs, as you know, from having Ashby and so on, are pretty good at it. You know, they really do pay a lot of attention to human cues. They do really seem to want to learn from what we're teaching them. And so we thought this would be a really great way to study questions related to human uniqueness. We have this species that is prone to learn from humans, is motivated to learn from humans.
Because they co-evolved with us.
Because they co-evolved with us, exactly.
How far back does that go? Do we know?
There's lots of debate on this sort of thing. The assumption is that dogs became domesticated in about 2 waves. So wave number 1 was that they just got really comfortable living around human settlements. This is probably the time when we were hunter-gatherers, and ancestral dogs at the time probably just got close enough to be part of our camps, right? And it was useful for us because they would alert us to when yucky things were about to happen, because they would probably bark and get scared. And it was useful for them because they got access to our scraps and our trash and our food. So that was probably wave number 1, is just becoming comfortable around us. And then the next wave was when we really started taking them with us and selecting them for particular traits, like really being around them more functionally. Yeah, and then teaming up to do specific kinds of tasks and so on.
Dogs are the only creatures that understand what we mean when we point, correct?
Domesticated animals for the most part. If you compare dogs, for example, to our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, dogs understand pointing in a way that no chimpanzee ever does. Even with many, many trials, they're just not getting that we're trying to communicate information to them. And Brian Hare, who's a very famous researcher on dogs, famously when he was an undergraduate student, was learning about this work in a class, and he raised a hand and he was like, "That's dumb, my dog can do that." And the teacher was like, "Well, your dog probably can't do that. You know, chimpanzees are much smarter than dogs." And it caused him to launch this research program where he really asked about social cues in dogs and found that dogs, in fact, could do this work.
Now, one of the things that you've determined is that compared to dogs, we humans, in a sense, overlearn from other people, in some cases to our detriment. But presumably that points to an eagerness to learn from others, which certainly seems to be our superpower as a species in order to cooperate and learn from one another.
A signature of our approach is that we get a lot of insight from the spots where human cognition breaks down, where smartness causes us to do these dumb things, these cases of cognitive biases and so on. And there are a few cases where our social learning leads us astray. So one is the phenomena you were alluding to, which is called over-imitation, which is we copy too much. Just seeing somebody intentionally do something makes us think it's the right way to do things. There's this apocryphal story of a young woman who's like taking over for the family for the first time, and she's baking the pot roast, and her husband sees her cutting the edges off the pot roast. And he's like, "Why do you cut the edges off the pot roast?" And it's like, "Well, that's what my mom always used to do." And so she calls her mom and is like, "Why do we cut the ends of the pot roast?" And mom's like, "That's what grandma always used to do." And they call grandma like, "Why do you cut the ends off the pot roast?" And she's like, "Oh, we just didn't have a big enough pan." Like, so that was why we did it.
I thought it was going to end in a seance to ask great-grandma.
No.
That's fun.
But this is the idea, is like, we think when people do things intentionally, there must be some good reason. It must be what you have to do. But oftentimes we just do things out of convenience. But the act of seeing somebody do it in a particular way can cause us to copy it and think it's the right thing to do when it might just be an accident. Researchers have tried to look at this, really setting up crazy ways to solve problems and trying to test particularly how human children will follow these crazy ways of solving problems. In one famous study, researchers gave kids a puzzle box where it was obvious that the way to open the puzzle box was just simply to open a door in the front of the puzzle box. But the puzzle box also had these features where there was a hole at the top of it that you could stick sticks into. It was obvious when the box was transparent that these things were just silly, like it just was sticking sticks into air and doing all these random extra steps. But what they found is that human children would copy these things really slavishly and really carefully, assuming that everything you did on this box was functional.
So the researcher would say, here's how you open this box, and they do these completely useless steps and poke holes into air and so forth, and then finally open the door, and the kids would learn to do it precisely like that.
That's right.
Whereas the dog would just open the door?
So at first, researchers had shown that chimpanzees don't copy these things. They're not prone to copy at all.
Then why do we say monkey see, monkey do?
I know there's a lot of malapropisms about monkeys.
Yes,
kind of
but
funny.
monkey see, monkey do is a doozy, it sounds like. Yeah.
No, they don't do this sort of thing. But we were interested in dogs because we thought, given that dogs follow human cues, maybe they've developed over domestication this bias too. Maybe learning from people comes with this kind of negative aspect where you copy too much.
Yeah.
But when we did the same kind of study with our dogs, we made a dog-friendly version of this puzzle box. What we found is that dogs do not over-imitate. In fact, just like chimpanzees, they do the efficient thing. And this is kind of exciting for dogs because it means that they've picked up on ways to copy us, but not with the same biases that we have.
Yeah, that's interesting.
They've in some ways made even more efficient ways to copy us and to pay attention.
And so we basically overweight the social information, we humans do. And again, that is probably the source of our superpowers because we get very good at learning from one another and transmitting information down the generations, which before we had written language had to be terribly important, but it can be very inefficient.
That's right.
So dogs would be very unlikely to join a crazy cult, for instance.
Exactly. Yeah. And then they seem like they weigh social information, but not necessarily over the information that they have.
Well, one of the interesting things about both sets of findings from the dogs and the monkeys, both sets of minds don't wander. It seems that dogs and monkeys are very, very present.
Yeah.
And so they don't start ruminating the past and modeling the future. And that's the kind of rumination that can make us very miserable. But it's also the kind of rumination and the kind of thought that enables planning and enables us to build pyramids and do other things that dogs struggle to do. Dogs famously struggle to build pyramids. So that transitions over to the fact that we are very capable, but we can make ourselves miserable. And you have made this pivot, or maybe like a doubling of what you do, because I know that you're still very engaged in this non-human cognition, to becoming very much of a happiness guru, not only here at Yale, but increasingly far beyond the confines of this campus. And I'd love to talk about where that came from. What caused you to decide that you wanted to teach a course on happiness after all these years of teaching courses on evolutionary psychology?
Yeah, well, it was kind of a strange pivot, which involved a personal change in my status at the university. And so I've been a professor at Yale for 16 years, where I'm in front of the classroom and dealing with students and so on. But it's just in the last 3 years that I became head of college, as we talked about before. The reason we're in this lovely house facing all these Benjamin Silliman portraits that are around us now. And that transition meant that instead of just seeing students in the classroom, as I did when I was a professor, I'm really seeing students up close and personal as a head of college. I eat with them in the dining hall. I see them in the courtyard. Just before this happened, I had a student who was in here crying about their relationship and so on. And so I'm really seeing their day-to-day.
It's much more familial. And you're seeing them again over a span of years.
Yeah, and it really feels like a family, where it feels like these students are, again, like my nieces and nephews or some sort of close family member who I care about a lot. And it was really in this capacity that I started to worry about modern day college students. I'd heard about the mental health crisis on college campuses, but I didn't see it up close and personal till I became a head of college, till you really see what their lives are like. And you see how much they are worried about future things and what kind of job they're going to get and so on. You see the amount of stress that they're under and how much depression and anxiety, and you see how little they sleep.
And this felt different from how it was when you were on campus as an undergrad in the 90s yourself.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we certainly had stresses, but not near the kind of level of mental health crisis and anxiety and just feeling overwhelmed that these students had. You know, I look back to my college days as fun days where I felt really socially connected and always had people around and there were parties. And that just doesn't feel like undergraduate life on Yale's campus right now.
And one of the statistics, they're sleeping on this campus an average of 4 to 5 hours a night.
We don't have great statistics at Yale, but those are the general statistics.
Nationwide. And there's no reason to think that they would diverge massively here.
And these are what students self-report. The other thing that students will report is that it feels like a contest to see who can sleep the least and who can study the most.
So you started developing these intuitions by being here.
Yeah.
It felt comparatively worse than when you were on campus. But then these amazing statistics, amazing in a bad way, have come out.
So this is a National College Health Assessment that does the assessment periodically to assess all kinds of things about college student health. I mean, it's about sexual health, it's about all kinds of aspects of their health. But buried in this assessment is information about mental health issues. And the statistics are pretty staggering, where you see in 2017, over 40% of students report being too depressed to function a lot of the time.
A lot of the time.
Yeah. Over 60% of students say that they feel overwhelmingly anxious a lot of the time. Over 50% say that they feel very hopeless. Over 50% say that they feel very lonely. And over 80% say that they feel overwhelmed by all they have to do constantly.
If you're feeling too depressed to function a lot of the time, and that's half of the kids.
Yeah. Or 2/3 who are too anxious to function. I mean, these are scary statistics as a college professor, because it means we're not meeting our educational mission if 2/3 of our students feel that anxious a lot of the time. We might think we're fooling ourselves or teaching them stuff, but they're just so fearful and triaging everything that comes in that we're not really meeting our mission.
I couldn't find the full survey, but there were different bits and pieces that were quoted. And one that I saw said 9% attempted suicide.
That's right. Yeah.
9%?
Mm-hmm. I mean, if 50% are hopeless a lot of the time and too anxious to function.
Maybe 9's pretty good, but nonetheless, that's a staggering number.
This is what you see as head of college, right? Where we have really acute mental health crises, where we will have multiple students who are really worried about things like suicide. And, I wasn't in this position when I was in college, but I just don't anticipate that the numbers were the same back then. So it really just felt like a crisis. And so the class emerged out of wanting to do something about that crisis. And because I'm a social scientist, I know a lot of the work on positive psychology. I know a lot of the work on behavior change. I know what the science says about the kinds of things you could do to feel better.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, why don't I just develop a class where I teach students all these facts about what really goes into well-being and what doesn't go into well-being.
And when did you decide this versus when was the first day of the class? Because it kind of came together quickly, didn't it?
Yeah. So I had the thought of doing this, and in fact ran a version of the class just for my Silliman students that we set up as kind of a salon in my house. And the students who came to it really resonated with it and really thought it was helpful. And so I thought, we'll turn it into a real Yale class.
You had a year to bat it around, but you were busy doing your job and looking after Silliman and so forth.
Exactly.
And then when did you start realizing this was going to be big?
So I submitted it to the committee that approves classes here at Yale. And they came back with no revisions on the course, which I thought was already interesting. And in fact, their only comment was like, I hope a lot of students take this class. It seems like it's going to be really useful.
And how fully fleshed out is the course when you submit it? Is it still kind of like a rough draft of the course?
It's really just the syllabus and all the assessments you have. So you submit what the midterms are going to be and that sort of thing. So we submit all that stuff. At Yale, students don't pre-register for classes. Particularly with a new course, you have no idea how many students are going to take it. I assumed it would be, as is typical for a Yale course, 50 students, 100 students if it was a really large class. We have a little website that tells us when students put your course on their schedule as a thing they're looking at to take.
It's in their cart, as they'd say on Amazon.
Exactly.
Got it. So you're in so many carts right now.
What was funny is that usually for most classes, the range of the graph would go from 0 to 100. But the range of my graph started going from 0 to 1,000. That's when I thought, that's weird that it's off by an order of magnitude.
Yeah.
What's happening? And so we had to teach it in the university chapel.
So this was the very first class session?
The very first class session, yeah. And then after the very first class session, it increased, and at its max was around 1,270 students, which is 1 out of every 4 students-ish at Yale.
And that is the most popular class in the 317-year history of this university, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then the media caught on to this. How did they figure that out so quickly? Because the New York Times piece was January.
Yeah, the New York Times piece was written by a Yale student.
Oh, I didn't realize.
He was the editor-in-chief at the Yale Daily News, who had also taken a job at the New York Times. So it was a bit of an inside job. In fact, I was very worried about the New York Times article, in part because there are different ways to take these national college health statistics. On the one hand, you could say, if this is a crisis, we have to act. Or you could say, what's wrong with these kids?
Toughen up.
Yeah.
The best way to calm somebody down who's really anxious is to scream at them to calm down.
Yes. Why are you so anxious?
Every time. Yeah, it works every time.
I mean, either way you look at these, what have we done to them, right? Because it's our adult generation that's parenting them. Part of me cares less about what's causing it. It's more like we have to do something about this. Again, we're missing our educational mission. And if this is who the university is putting out, where 60% of students are too anxious to function, 40% are too depressed to function, what is industry going to look like in 5 years' time? These folks are out and not just behind these Ivy League walls, they're in the workforce in a year's time. But the New York Times article was very positive, but it launched a wave of other, both national press. I was on NBC Nightly News and on the Today Show. Lots of international press. I was in Figaro and La Semana, and there was many
articles. Like the New York Times of many different countries.
Exactly. But it really was like every international or national news organization that I could think of. But I think it speaks to the fact that it's not just college students who are facing this mental health crisis.
And it's not just Yale. It's not just elite college students. It probably goes all the way back to middle school, and it probably radiates all the way forward into adulthood.
I mean, I think we're dealing with a time where people are just much more unhappy than they expect. I think the press wasn't so much about these college students. It was more about these poor Yale kids are depressed and anxious. Like, what about the rest of us? We need this too.
Yale sucks less than most places.
Yeah.
I can say that definitively. And to me, when I think about elite campuses, just what kids have to do in order to get in. And I went to an elite school, but decades ago, and it wasn't easy to get in there. Go on, Ashby. Go say hi.
It's when Puppy realizes we're talking about emotional subjects. So she's going to come over and be nice to us here.
Little dog. But I felt when I did what I needed to do to get into a competitive school, I was kind of playing a game that maybe 10 or 15% of the kids at my high school were playing. It was hard. I worked really, really hard, and I probably did the same kinds of things that people do today in much greater number. But just the level of competition was nothing like it is now. I don't think I'd have a prayer of getting into Stanford today. But then the other thing that is qualitatively different about the lived experience of being a modern American is social media. It's ubiquity. And I personally spend very, very little time on social media, but I'm certain if it were around when I was in college, I'd be on it constantly. And I would imagine that that is a significant culprit.
Yeah, it's hard to say exactly what the cause is, but social media increases a lot of the things that we know make people prone to feel more unhappy. So things like social comparison. It really sets up some unrealistic reference points where you see other people's awesome vacations and other people's awesome jobs and
spin-doctored versions of themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's hard not to feel jealous of that stuff. It's hard not to make a downward social comparison. The other thing is that we know social media decreases the kinds of things that really do seem to matter for well-being. So a lot of the research in positive psychology suggests that things like social connection matters a lot for well-being, but that's really like live in-person connection. I think social media gives us this illusion of social connection, but at a real opportunity cost of talking to humans in real life.
Has the cognitive science of happiness come a long way in the past 2 or 3 decades? Is it much more feasible to teach a course that gives actionable insights to people than it would have been a couple decades back?
The science of positive psychology has taught us a lot, both within the field of positive psychology directly and in related fields in things like social cognition and social psychology. We're just learning a lot. Even things like neuroscience is teaching us a lot of the work on the power of meditation and how it works. We're really getting some insights from neuroscientific techniques that might not have even existed in the same way 2-3 decades ago. And I think it's a great time to be teaching this work because we have so much good science on it.
One of the things that really intrigued me from one of the early lectures is that 40% of happiness is to some degree under our control. Maybe 50% is genetic and about 10% is circumstantial. Did I get that roughly correct?
Yeah, and those estimates are hard to give, right?
They're hard to give,
we're making claims about epigenetics, which is really complicated. But this comes from work by Sonia Lyubomirsky and her colleagues who really tried to do this impossible task of figuring out how much of our happiness is built in. But if you look at some of the heritability estimates that come from things like twin studies, a decent chunk of our well-being seems heritable.
Yeah.
Very little of it is based on our circumstances, much less than we think.
Unless you're in extreme poverty or something.
Exactly. Extreme negative circumstances matter a lot more than the good side. So yes, if you're in extreme poverty, you should try to get out of that. But barring that, changing your circumstances a lot is probably not going to help you that much. And the claim then is that some decent chunk of our happiness is really due to our own effort, to the kinds of practices we engage in that we talk about in the class.
And whether it's actually 40% or 35 or 45, if your class was about how to live 40% longer or how to make 40% more income, you would have America's undivided attention. That is a very, very big chunk.
And I think it's really good news is that if things were under our control, but we had to win $1 million, you had to grossly change your life circumstances, that would be really hard.
Yeah.
I mean, these things are simple practices. It's 10 minutes of meditation a day. It's 5 minutes at the end of the day to think about what you're grateful for. It's taking time for your friends and family members. None of this is incredibly hard. You just have to do it.
You said practices, and that's key. You use the analogy in multiple places of exercise, and I think that's a really good one.
Yeah.
I mean, if you told me you can just do 20 sit-ups and you're going to have fabulous abs for the next 3 years, I'd be psyched, but it probably wouldn't work out so well.
You got to do it every day. You can't just do it on Tuesday and dust your hands off and think you're done.
Definitely not. And that's one of the things that the class has taught is the practice of it, and it was indeed a part of the requirements.
That's right. Both the online class and the live class had these we call rewirements, because they're requirements to rewire your habits, where we really try to have people focus on the practices that research suggests are going to help.
One of the most intriguing things to me about your work is identifying those cognitive distortions and tendencies that make us miserable. And one of the biggest ones that you focused on is that our intuitions about what will make us happy tend to be terrible.
Yeah, in class they say our intuitions suck.
Our intuitions completely suck. Give a few examples of intuitions that people will have of X is going to make me happy, therefore I'm going to kill myself to get X, and they turn out to be dead wrong.
Salary is a big one. The perception that salary is really important has been increasing over time. It's at its highest levels. Research suggests that, in fact, for most of the salaries that Yale students are going to make, increasing your salary very much isn't going to help. In fact, there's work by Danny Kahneman and Angus Deaton suggesting that in the US, at least after about $75K, boosting your salary anymore will not increase your well-being on most of the well-being measures they looked at. So it won't make you less stressed. It won't make you have more positive emotions. You're just going to flatline on happiness at a certain salary level. It's not what we forecast, but it's what matters. Another thing that our students forecast is that getting perfect grades will make them really happy. In practice, there is evidence of a correlation between grades and well-being, but it's an inverse correlation.
Oh, that's unsurprising,
and when you think about
actually.
these students who are killing themselves to get good grades, you can see why that is.
Well, what's really striking about the things that people miswant, as you've identified them in your coursework, is they're very expensive to obtain. So if I really want to have a lot of money, that means mortgaging a very large percentage of my waking hours for a very large percentage of my life. If I really want to have a 4.0 grade point average at Yale, that is going to mean crippling amounts of work versus if I were going to be happy with a 3.0. Those are expensive, vastly expensive in terms of time. And they would certainly tend to crowd out those relatively contained exercises that could get us that 40% bump.
Yeah.
And again, 40%, when you first said it, I was driven by these conflicting emotions because on the one hand, I was like,
only 40%.
That's all?
Yeah.
But on another part, I felt very relieved and validated because usually these goofy self-help books tell you everything's under your control. And we know that that's a pure falsehood. 40% is a great deal. But if I'm making these colossally expensive investments in things that really are full-time pursuits, like great grades, perfect body, enormous amount of money, it is going to crowd everything else out. There's something you mentioned in a public lecture, I'm not sure if you mentioned it in the course, was that 6 months after winning the lottery or 6 months after becoming paraplegic, two extreme good, extreme horrible, within about 6 months, people tend to reset to the level of happiness and contentment that they had prior to that. So they get used to the extravagant upside of the lottery and then it just becomes background. But more surprising and certainly a lot more inspiring to me is a terrible crushing blow they tend to recover from fairly quickly. And so again, when I think of these extravagantly expensive investments that need to be made to succeed on these miswanted things, it's like, wow, that really invalidates all that striving. You really should be working on that 40%.
A lot of this comes from work by folks like Dan Gilbert and colleagues studying this power of what we often call affective forecasting, where we are doing these forecasts about what's going to make us happy. And our forecasts are just incredibly wrong. And so one problem is we're carrying around this machinery in our head that's really bad at forecasting what will make us happy.
But at the same time, we're always assessing ourselves, as you said earlier, relative to one another rather than on an absolute scale.
That's right.
And that's why going from earning $30,000 a year to $100,000 a year doesn't seem to satisfy people. A big part of the reason is suddenly they're hanging out with a bunch of people who are earning $150,000 a year.
Exactly. And so it's never the level that you're at. It's always a moving target. And the target gets further away, the higher your salary goes
and
up.
being a big fish in a small pond might be much more satisfying ultimately, but people exit the small pond as soon as they're able because that's what humans do. And there was one study that you cited that I thought was fascinating where there's a particular lottery, maybe it's in Scandinavia, where the winner gets X dollars and a new car. And they were tracking the behavior of neighbors of the new car winners and saw that they were twice as likely to buy a new car themselves because Johan down the street just got a new car.
Exactly. And so it's like the physical presence of seeing the car is too much. You have to buy a new one, no matter where you were in your car buying cycle before. Yeah.
And you had that funny cartoon, okay, if you can't see your way to giving me a pay raise, how about giving Parkinson a pay cut? That's funny because on a certain guilty level, we get it.
Yep.
Yeah, that's kind of human nature. And the other thing that you cited that really did astound me, people were given at least a hypothetical choice between earning $50,000 in an office in which everybody else earns $25,000 per year versus earning $100,000 per year in an office in which everybody else is making $250,000.
Yep.
And roughly half of the people said they would prefer
the first one,
the condition in which they're relatively wealthy but absolutely impoverished compared to the second circumstance. That boggled my mind. And the third thing is something I had not heard of this before, hedonic adaptation, which is such a great sciencey sounding term.
Yeah. So hedonic adaptation sounds fancy, but it really is just this idea that we get used to stuff. So the first ice cream that you eat is really wonderful, but the next ice cream cone and the ice cream cone after that, you get these diminishing returns. But there's also these phenomena of impact bias and focalism, which are really just that we think that things are going to have an impact much bigger than they have, and we think this impact is going to be for longer than it has. One example that comes from a study done in Harvard where they find out midway through their first year what residential college they're going to be in or what house.
Is it assigned randomly?
It's assigned randomly, yeah.
And there are more desirable addresses and less desirable addresses.
Exactly. And students know that. And what you find is that people think that they'll be happier more than they end up being when they find out the good college. So we kind of mess up this idea of the impact. And one of the reasons we do that is we tend to be focused on particular things. So if you found out you were in a bad residential college, you focus on that piece of information. But you forget there's other things at Yale than your residential college. Like it's going to rain some days, it's going to be sunny, you'll have classes that you like or don't like, and so on. So much of the other stuff matters more than this one focus point that we pay too much attention to. And that's focalism. When you highlight a particular thing, people focus on that. So it's very easy for our affective forecasting to go astray. It's very easy for us to forget that we adapt to things and that we get messed up by particular reference
And therefore
points.
you over struggle to avoid things that are less horrifying than you think, like getting a C.
Exactly.
And you might ruin nights of sleep and start sleeping 4 hours a night. On the opposite side, you might struggle very hard for many, many years to get the $250,000 salary that at some point you decided would be arbitrarily adequate.
Yep.
So getting back to the rewirements, what's the right way to track these sorts of things in order to have success in obtaining these new habits and gaining this delight advantage?
Yeah. So this is one of the sad things about the live version of this class is that because I thought it was going to be 40 or 50 people, we didn't put great tools in place to track it because I thought I just asked them in the seminar type
Show of
format.
hands.
Yes.
Oh, you didn't raise your hand last week, did you? Yeah. That doesn't work when it gets 1,200.
So we assigned these rewirements. Students had one per week, but we weren't tracking whether or not students were actually doing these different kinds of things. And that is scientifically sad. We did really have this opportunity to have one of the biggest sample sizes in the history of positive psychology that we failed to get pre and post data
You'll
on.
get
So
that in another year's
live and
time.
learn. But yeah, I mean, students really could do them if they wanted to. And so all we have is really anecdotal evidence. But what we hear from the students is that those students who took time for gratitude, tried to do meditation, and took time to make more social connection and exercise and sleep, students who self-reported doing these things reported that their happiness levels on these standard positive psychology rating measures went up statistically.
Now, to get into some of the concrete things that can make people happier, I'd like to start with better wanting. And one of the things that you had suggested was this notion of character strengths, which Marty Seligman pioneered, correct?
Yeah. So character strengths are, in Marty's view, these universal virtues that people have. So the things like love of learning and curiosity and leadership and bravery, just these character strengths that cross-culturally people think, those are virtues, those are good things.
They're uncontroversial.
Exactly. But what Marty finds and what research has found is that people differ in the extent to which those strengths resonate with them. So he's developed an interesting character strengths quiz where you can figure out which are the character strengths that you have.
Marty Seligman himself.
And his colleagues.
And his colleagues, yeah. And I took that quiz. It felt pretty rigorous.
Yeah. And people think you do this quiz and they think like, oh, some stupid BuzzFeed quiz. But these are well-validated psychological instruments that folks have put a lot of time into knowing about the validity of them and the fact that everyone can take them and they're cross-culturally viable. So it's worth remembering these are real instruments. But as you do this, you're able to discover which of these strengths do you really feel resonate with you, that they're the kinds of things that really represent you. And those are what's called your signature strengths. Those of your character strengths that you really feel are part of you.
And those are ideally, if the test is quote unquote accurate, the top 5 or 6 that will pop out of the test.
Exactly.
And at least that will give you a hint and you can start feeling that resonance in your own soul. Like, that is me.
Yes, exactly. And often what happens when people see those, they're like, oh yeah, those are the things that really are important to me. What research suggests is that when you exercise those strengths of yours that are your signature strengths, you tend to enjoy your work more. It tends to feel more meaningful. Even if you can just reframe the work that you're doing as being part of those strengths. So for example, imagine you're just working as a janitor somewhere. Well, if your strength is social connection, then you can try to see your job as being sociable and connecting up with people. It's just the matter of reframing what you do as part of those very different strengths can be incredibly powerful.
And so then, because the most expensive thing we can invest in is making more money in terms of the time costs and the stress costs, the core suggestion is make this be your guidance to your job and your career.
Exactly.
As opposed to this pays $250,000 and that pays $150,000 and that pays $30,000. So long as they're above the level of dire poverty.
Yeah. And for students, they often think, like, do you want to be a doctor? Do you want to be a lawyer? You don't often think, do you want a job where you can be brave and curious? Or do you want a job where you love learning or can show kindness? These just aren't the categories that people are thinking of. And the character strengths, it allows you to think more about whether you're picking a profession that fits with your strengths. And even if you have a profession now, how you can
reframe it.
Exactly.
The other thing that you mentioned in one of the interviews was trading off money and time in a way that you wouldn't otherwise be inclined to do.
Yeah.
And so if you're in the fortunate position to be able to pay a little bit more money to rid yourself of a time sink that you just find really unpleasant. And I did something like that myself when my wife and I were living in Los Angeles. I don't like driving in general. And I particularly didn't like driving there. And we were living there just when Uber and Lyft were becoming a big thing. And they were in these crazy price wars with each other where they were paying their drivers 3 times as much as they were actually charging their passengers. And I started saying, wow, I can just pay X dollars an hour. My time is worth more than that. My stress is worth more than that. And it was one of the big pivot points. I really started to like LA.
What you realize is that there are just simple ways that you can save some time if you can spend some money. And again, this is all for those of us who are
You're lucky enough to be in that situation.
Exactly.
And we all are to some degree. You can find little hacks where you can save yourself hassle. Sometimes it's a barter thing.
Yes.
You know, like, I really hate to drive, but for some weird reason, I don't mind doing laundry.
Yep.
And you can team up with friends to start arbitraging misery and hedonic delight and that kind of thing. Well, this feeds right into one of my favorite phrases from your class, which is time affluence. So explain what that is, please, and how you explain that to your students and how you granted that to your students.
Yeah. So time affluence is this phenomena of really just being wealthy in time, right? When your friend's like, oh, we should get together for coffee. And you're like, well, how about never? That's the opposite of time affluence. That is what we call time famine, right? Where you're just famished for time and you're triaging things all over the place. I mean, this is what our students are telling us when they say over 80% of them feel too overwhelmed to function. Like, they're incredibly time famished. But what research suggests is that being wealthy in time might be even more important than being wealthy in money for increasing well-being. So people that just have some time on their hands that aren't so time-strapped often feel happier. And research suggests that people who trade off time for money, so in other words, will give up money to get more time, end up happier.
They'll take a lower paying job in the macro sense.
Exactly.
Or they'll impoverish themselves by buying Uber and Lyft and not driving and having fewer luxuries as a result, but being happier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Perfect example. So the story about the class was that I found it very ironic that I was going to teach students about time affluence, bring them to class and give them readings about time affluence because they're so time famished. First of all, it felt like no one knew what time affluence was because they've never experienced it. And also it felt ironic that I would remove some of their time affluence, basically make them more time famished to teach them this lecture. So we did this cute thing where on the day of the time affluence lecture, students came to class and my TFs were there handing out flyers. And the flyers said, today's lecture is about time affluence. I'm going to teach you what that is by gifting you some. And so there's no class today. You have a whole hour and a half that's free.
That you were not expecting.
That you were not expecting.
And you don't have another thing you're supposed to do.
You walked to class. You really thought you were going to be there. And the rule was that students had to do something with the hour and a half that promoted their well-being. Because I knew Yale students would find this so foreign, I gave them a big list like, go to the museum, check out the botanical garden, take a nap. And it was this big long list. What was amazing was some students were totally shocked and so happy. Several students hugged my TFs and I. 2 students burst into tears.
Oh.
And one of the students who burst into tears said it was the first free hour that she's had all semester.
It was like you wrote her a $10,000 check. It was like winning the time lottery.
Exactly. We forget how often just canceling that long-standing meeting where it's not really essential and just giving ourselves an hour, we forget how powerful that can be to just give ourselves a little bit of time. I told students that if you do something cool, write back to me and tell me what you did. And the students did these amazing things. Like they went to one of the recording studios at the university and made a jam session and wrote like a song about the class. Or one group of students, they decided to go hike in East Rock Park. It also happened that it was a lovely day that we happened to do this, which was great. And while they were hiking in East Rock Park, they met up with another group of students who were also hiking at East Rock Park. So they realized like, oh, you must be from the class. And they chatted with them and got to know them and made these new friends. I'm like, this is just the power, just simple hour to take some time off. It can be so much more powerful than we think.
So there's the macro and the micro. So the macro is take a job that pays less money but gives you more time.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the micro is what we were talking about, like impoverish yourself on Uber and you can buy fewer treats and fewer goodies, but you have more time.
One other thing is just schedule things in your calendar that aren't scheduled.
Yeah.
Put in the Google Calendar for 2 or 3 weeks from now, like nothing.
Yeah.
Just time off.
Here's this 90-minute boom.
Yeah, just 90 minutes in the middle of some random Tuesday.
And your commitment to yourself is you won't pre-decide what you do then.
Correct.
And it won't be laundry.
Those are hard to commit to keeping there because things creep in. But if you can commit to keeping those open spaces, it just will feel amazing when it finally shows up.
Now, one of the rewirements that you assigned and also talked about quite a bit in the class is something I'd never heard of before that I found to be very powerful, which is negative visualization.
Yeah, so negative visualization is an idea that originated in the Stoic philosophy, where the Stoic philosophers thought that you should start every day by meditating on the fact that your spouse is going to leave you, you might die, you're going to die at some point, your kids could die, your car could break down. And the reason they thought that was powerful is like, if today happens and you get stuck in traffic, but your spouse didn't die and your kids are still alive, it makes the getting stuck in traffic feel pretty stupid. Your new reference point is horrible things happening to you. And so negative visualization is just this technique that you can do to like think about like the worst it could possibly be. And it really makes what's happening now not feel that bad.
But another thing that you had suggested to also thwart hedonic adaptation was to think about something that you have that's very precious and special that you fought hard for or that cost you a lot that you're now used to.
Yeah.
And my wife and I moved to a much better apartment in New York not long ago, just a few months ago. And it's better on 30 mid-sized things. There's no one big thing, but on 30 mid-sized things, it's just better in every way.
Yep.
And it's been a few months. And so when I heard that part of the lecture, I decided that each morning for a few days, I'd wake up and pretend I was waking up in the old apartment.
Mm-hmm.
And then coming into this awesome place that we're in. And it lets you see it with new eyes.
Yeah.
And you could do that with a friendship. You could do that with a job that was a pinnacle to get to this job that you have. You can do it with your little dog.
People have these moments where you think something's lost. You lose your luggage on a plane and then it's found. That one sentimental thing that you happen to pack and it was so silly when it finally comes back to you, it's like, oh, or people who think they've lost their wedding ring or their wallet or their phone. When these things come back, you realize, oh my God, I really did value this thing and love it. And so the great thing about our minds is that we can trick our minds a little bit. It's not like you think you live in the old apartment anymore.
No, not at all.
But there's part of you that's like, hang on, this new apartment seems a little bit better.
It just makes you remember how awesome it is.
Yeah.
And that's an easy thing to put yourself back in. If you're in a job that's pretty good, but you've gotten used to it, but it beats the hell out of your old one, it's pretty easy about once a week to spend a few minutes remembering what's so awesome about this job. And then there's the negative one, the Stoic thing of acknowledging that all these things could go away.
Yeah.
And I think a gentler way of saying that is to not quite say, Ashby the dog might drop dead tomorrow morning, but more say, let me just imagine that we're moving out of New York and this is our last walk in our neighborhood.
Yep.
And I know it's not. That's the awesome thing. And it really is an incredibly powerful lens, and you can access it very quickly. And a really surprising and interesting thought that you threw out in one of the lectures was maybe commercials made TV more satisfying.
Yeah. Basically, we can thwart hedonic adaptation anytime we get a break. Anytime we have a break in something good, when we come back to it, we've come from this reference point of not having the good thing to a good thing. And this is something you often forget. You get like a delicious cupcake and you like plow through it, like bite, 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 bite. But if you had some of it, put it aside, came back to it in 2 hours, you'd spend that 2 hours not feeling used to the cupcake. So when the cupcake comes out again, it's like, oh my God, this is so delicious again. But a funny thing is that commercials do this for us.
Did this for us back in the day.
Yeah. And so we're enjoying, some show and, the commercial, it's kind of annoying. But then, the show's back. There's research studies to suggest that commercials do make things more enjoyable. It's not what we forecast.
Yeah.
It's not what we seek out. In fact, now that we have TiVo and things, we want to get rid of them. But a simple pause in something is not something we predict is going to make us like it, but in fact, it makes us like it.
Well, binge watching TV is something that wasn't accessible to us. And I'll never forget, I jokingly tell my buddy Al that it was really bad of him to tell me about Breaking Bad when it was midway through its second season, because then I sometimes had to wait as long as 15 months for it to start up again.
Yep.
But I discovered Rick and Morty 3 seasons in. Binging Rick and Morty was a pure delight. One of the finest things that's ever happened to me, I'm going to tell you. But if I had watched it one episode and then had to just wait for a week for the next one to come out. It would feel so much
better when the next one came out.
Each minute of Rick and Mortiness would have been more delightful.
Exactly.
Just as each minute of Breaking Badness was really, really fantastic back in the day. Now, a related thing, which I think is excellent advice, is to buy experiences and not things. And to quote Dan Gilbert, who comes up a lot in your course, a new car sticks around to disappoint you, but a trip to Europe is over. It evaporates. It has the good sense to go away and leave you with nothing but your wonderful memory. That's cool.
Yeah. And that's what the research suggests, is that one of the reasons that money isn't making us happy is that we tend not to spend it on the right stuff. We tend not to use it to buy time. We tend to buy stuff, these objects. And the bad thing about objects, as Gilbert nicely points out, is that they stick around. Hopefully I buy an iPhone that's not going to die in like 2 days. But that means in 2 days, when I'm totally used to this new iPhone, it's still there. And I'm not getting really as much happiness bang for my buck from these purchases that I've made, these item purchases, these thing purchases. But experiences, they just don't last long enough for you to get used to them.
Yeah.
They also have these other good features where they often promote social connection. So often we're not doing these experiences by ourselves. We go with other people.
And people want to hear about your ski trip. They don't want to hear about your new fancy car.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you can share that with people and draw them closer, because people are excited to hear about a cool, weird trip you took. The weirder and cooler, the better. And they want to share that with you vicariously. When I talk to somebody about having had a crazy experience, whether it was a particular party or a night on the town or Burning Man, I'm never thinking, oh, this person's so full of themselves. They're just bragging.
Whereas if people talk about their car or their new house,
this expensive thing that they've bought, it's a very, very different thing. And the other thing that you mentioned in one of your lectures is it's impossible to really compare your experience to somebody else's. If you went on a ski trip and really enjoyed it, your enjoyment of it is not going to be eclipsed by finding out that somebody else went on a different ski trip. I mean, how can you possibly compare those two things? Whereas if I'm really excited about my 1991 Nissan Sentra, and I was for over 10 years, I could be a little bit eclipsed if somebody shows up with a fancier car.
Correct.
Because those are more directly comparable. Social connection, you've mentioned a number of times. Let's talk about that momentarily on both a micro and a macro level, because it is such a fascinating thing and it comes up so often in the work that you relayed.
Yeah. So if you look at very happy people, what you find is that very happy people tend to take time for the people they care about, their friends, their family members, their lovers, but they also just spend more time with people, period. You just have people estimate the amount of time they spend doing different things. Very happy people report just spending time with others.
Yeah.
It seems to be the one factor that really sets very happy people apart from the rest of us. And it suggests that just simply being social is much more important than we realize. Based on that correlation, you could say, well, maybe happy people are happy because they're social, or maybe social people are social because they're happy, right? They're happy, so they want to hang out with other people. And so a bunch of research has now been looking at what happens if you force people to be social or just kind of instruct them to be more social. And this is some lovely work by Nick Epley and his colleagues who go up to folks on the L train in Chicago. Nick's a professor at Chicago Business School. And you ask people, for the rest of the train ride, I want you to just be social with the people next to you. Really try to make a social connection.
Is he armed? Like, how does he force people to do this?
I think,
how does he
they're
pull
Midwestern.
That off? Yeah.
I mean, they're in a study, so they're probably getting paid for doing the study.
Yeah.
And so
they're told you're going to be commuting, you're going to be on this train. Is it a long train or short? Is it like a subway ride?
I think it's their normal commute. So he goes up to people, a normal 20-minute, half-hour commute or so.
Got it. And says to some of them, do what you want. And to some of them, you're going to talk to the person next to you.
Or to some of them, you're going to be trying to enjoy your solitude as best as possible. For the whole train ride, don't talk to anybody. And so he has people predict, if you were in these different conditions, how positive would you feel after this? And what you find is that people predict, like maybe some of your listeners might be predicting, which is that the connection condition feels a little awkward. Like you're going to have to talk to this total stranger. It's going to be weird. Much rather would be in the condition where I just enjoy my solitude or do what I want. In fact, I'd feel better after the solitude condition. That's what people predict. But what really happens is just the opposite. What really happens is that people are much happier after the connection condition. And in fact, it's not just that people are less happy in the solitude condition. People's emotions actually go down from baseline in the solitude condition, which makes sense because if you're just enjoying your silence on this train, what are you doing? You start mind wandering and worrying about your taxes, and it makes you not enjoy it as much as really connecting with another person.
This was the one thing that I was most torn about when I was listening to your lectures and then also doing some outside reading on it. Because on the one hand, it seems like, boy, this is bad news for introverts. Mm-hmm. And some of the people I'm closest to in my life are introverts. And they really do gain a great deal of positive energy from their alone time. And so there's that dimension to it. But there's also these very micro things that I found to be fascinating. Just looking people in the eye on the street. Just having the briefest of interactions when you're going to Starbucks, if you are in a taxi or an Uber, if you're stuck in the elevator with somebody, even if you're an introverted person and you really do prefer to spend a great deal of time alone, you are going to be in those interactions with people throughout a normal day. And that was something that I experimented with a little bit over the last few weeks. And I found that to be almost invariably a positive thing. When you catch somebody's eye, even if you just smile at them, it can pull you out of your little bubble.
That's right. And those are the kinds of things that can break up loneliness in ways that we don't expect, just really trying to engage. Just on the introvert point, so Epley and colleagues were worried about this, that this would be really a personality-driven effect. And what they find is that extroverts show the effect more than introverts, but introverts show the effect much more than they forecast. Extroverts forecast like it's going to be bad, but introverts are like, this is going to really suck. But in fact, both get the benefit. And again, extroverts get slightly more of a benefit, but it's still an incorrect forecast to say introverts just shouldn't do these things. One of the things we need to think about are what are the barriers to doing these kinds of things. We talked a little bit about social media and things earlier. This is another spot where social media gets in the way. When I'm in the line to order my coffee at the coffee shop, like I could be smiling and acknowledging or talking to the person next to me, but instead I'm looking, not making eye contact only with my phone. This is a spot where I think tech makes it harder to really even engage.
Yeah, and I'd say whether it's social media or anything else, the mere presence of a smartphone is really destructive to the micro interactions of which there are probably billions fewer per day across society.
I think that's true.
Because it's so easy and it's also less awkward. But if you're in the elevator, you instantly pull out your phone. It doesn't make it seem like you're standoffish. It's sort of a neutral thing and it feels unawkward. And so I think it would be interesting to calculate how many billions of micro interactions have been dampened by the ubiquity of tech and the fact that whether we're reading our email or social media or the New York Times, it's just there when we're with other people.
Yeah. And this is a thing that we forget is both how many interactions are gone from these things and just the structure of tech is really set up to eliminate these human interactions. David Byrne, the musician, has this lovely essay called Eliminating the Human, where he makes this claim that a lot of what tech is doing, a lot of what it's designed to do is to eliminate the human interaction around us. So think about Uber, right? Before you'd call a cab and you'd have to physically call a person, you'd talk to a person on the phone, the cab would come, you'd have to explain where you're going. Now I program my Uber on my phone, I walk in, I don't have to talk to somebody. Think of things like automatic checkouts, even automatic Starbucks ordering, right? Where you make the order before you walk in, it's on the side for you, your coffee's just waiting, you just grab it, right? we think these subtle interactions don't matter. We think our lives would be more streamlined if we got rid of them. But in practice, they might be really improving our well-being, making us feel less lonely. All these micro interactions matter a lot. But a lot of the sheer purpose of tech and different apps is to get rid of those over time. Think about ordering books on Amazon or Spotify music, right? We used to have record stores where you'd go in and talk to the record store owner about their picks and have these social interactions, but learn socially from this cultural learning that we find so important in our species. And all of those have gone away. The other thing that we forget is how attention-grabbing technology is for us.
Yes.
And there's new research showing the mere presence of a phone during dinner or during some sort of cognitive task is messing us up in all these ways. On the other side of that phone is all of YouTube, is all of my email, any interaction that I ever want to learn about in anything in the world. And for my husband and I to have a nice dinner conversation, that conversation is competing with literally all of YouTube that at a press of a button would be there. And research by folks like Liz Dunn and colleagues has started to show that the mere physical presence of a phone, even if it's shut off, but on the table or in your purse and so on, it's messing up our interactions. Just the mere presence of having it there is messing us up.
Another thing that can be practiced on a micro level is kindness. And there was this fascinating experiment that you talked about where, people were given what to us is a small amount of money and said either splurge on yourself or buy something for somebody else. They found that to be satisfying to buy something for somebody else. But the fascinating thing was that was also true in economies where that was a lot of money.
So this is also work Liz Dunn I just mentioned and Mike Norton and their colleagues. So we know from lots of work on charities that people who give to charity tend to be happier. And this is true across income. So every income level, people who give more to charity at that income level are happier than people who don't. But again, you could say, is this giving to charity make people happier if you
or do happy people give
more to charity? Exactly. And so they did this intervention where they walked up to folks on the street and said, hey, here's $5. Either spend that $5 on yourself or spend that $5 on someone else. And what they find is that at the end of the day, and even at the end of the week, people who spend the money on someone else end up reporting being happier than those who spent the money on themselves. But the cool thing was you might think that that's just like $5. Who cares?
Because it was originally done in Canada, right?
Correct. So it was
and everybody
Canadian
in Canada is loaded.
Yes, exactly. In Vancouver. So
Vancouver, the rents there are pretty darn high. So $5 is not a lot in Vancouver.
But what would be great is if we had enough grant funding to give away millions of dollars in these studies in Canada. I couldn't do that. But they were able to do is go to a place where $5 has a lot more buying power. And so they went to rural Uganda, where $5 I'm told, can buy things like AIDS medication for several weeks and so on. And so rerunning the experiment there, what you find is that the same Canadian amounts of dollars will still make you happier if you spend that money on someone else than if you spend the money on yourself. And so experimentally, even when we induce people to do nice things for others, first of all, they still have the effect that they chose to do something nice, which is kind of funny. I'll tell you, go do something nice for others, and you still get this kind of happiness.
Yeah, like, God, that was nice of me.
That was I'm such a good person. But beyond that doing that for somebody else is better than doing that for ourselves.
It creates a bigger hedonic uptick in a sense if you're doing it for somebody else.
I also have a mind that lies to me, even though I know the science. Here's one where I often mess up. If I have a really bad day at work, I'm big on like treat yourself, as we hear from Parks and Recs and these TV shows. I want to get a manicure, or I want to get a nice latte or a cupcake, or I want to do something nice for myself. It's really hard in that moment to be like, actually, what would make me happier is to like gift this cupcake to someone else. But if you can force yourself to do that, sometimes it can be really powerful, much more powerful than you think.
As you shape the course, as you have hundreds of thousands, then millions of Coursera students, as you have thousands and then tens of thousands of Yale students, I think a really interesting pool of wisdom you could gather are suggestions. 25 random acts of kindness you can do. Because it's one thing if somebody comes up and gives you a $5 Starbucks gift card, and then you can turn around and hand that to one of your friends at the table. That's a pretty easy thing. Living in New York City, it's relatively easy to get opportunities to commit random acts of kindness because you can open the door for somebody. You can look at a pedestrian who's struggling. And I imagine a university campus, same thing.
Yep.
It's probably relatively target-rich environment if you want to go do kind things for people. But I think normal people in busy lives in the suburbs who decide like, yes, this is something I'd really like to do.
Yeah.
What are 25 or 30 or 40 or 50 things? Over the course of doing this course, you'll come up, I think, with a very powerful resource for society. Because I'd look at that and say, oh, wow, those 25 I can do. That's in my wheelhouse, or that's in my neighborhood. Well, now you've built this incredible platform without realizing that you were. What are your hopes and ambitions for the course going forward? You're going to teach it again next year. Is that correct?
That's right. So
they're taking a year off.
Yeah, we'll teach the live version next year. And we took a year off in part because basically everyone at Yale's taken it already.
Yes, everybody who wants to take it is definitely
already taken it. And we're looking into ways to develop content that we can do with K through 12 students. Because my sense is that in some ways, teaching Yale students this stuff now is a little bit too late. They've already reaped the benefit of all their unhealthy practices that got them to Yale in the first place, like not sleeping and foregoing social connection and prioritizing the wrong things and so on. And so we'd really like this content to get out earlier. I might be starting my own podcast down the line. We'll see how that emerges. But with the idea of thinking about these quick tips that folks can do to boost their well-being. And finally, a book is in the works, hopefully.
I just had a funny thought as you roll this out to K through 12, and I think that's a wonderful thing to do. You might be undermining Yale's market. I'm saying that playfully, but...
No, you don't need to say it playfully. There's a deep irony to teaching this class at Yale. There's a deep irony to telling students, hey, don't worry about salary or grades or all these things. Focus on the things that matter. Just take a break. It's really antithetical to the mission of lots of colleges, which is to plop out students, many of whom go into finance and these kinds of things. Capitalism more broadly, right? We have a system where all these things that our mind seems to value that are wrong is what the system wants us to go out and do, like buy stuff, make lots of money. It's not just be present. And I was recently giving a talk on this work to a bunch of investors in Asia. And the first question they asked was like, I get all this science stuff, but like, how do we monetize this? And it was like, well, we don't.
Can we build an app?
Yeah, we don't, There is this real irony, and it's one of the reasons I want to teach this stuff earlier and earlier, is that by the time kids get into Yale and have won that lottery to get into a place like
by
this,
the fact they've gotten into Yale,
it might be too late.
They've really internalized these things. Well, that begs the obvious question that you are becoming a person of enormous influence here, probably in some ways as a result of this course, certainly in many ways as a result of having been here for 15 years and not just 1 year, and you're going to be here for quite some time, and now you're ahead of college and so forth. What should Yale and let's say the other 100 selective schools from which the other thousands of schools take so many cues, is there any should here, whether it's Yale or McKinsey or whatever highly selective organization is out there that people are busting their tails to get into, because if they don't bust their tails, they're really not going to get in?
The shoulds are really difficult because Yale might realize what it's doing might not be increasing the well-being of our students to the point that it's ruining their educational mission. Maybe there's like some decrease of the well-being of students because you want them to study and so on, but we're well past that, right? We're in the zone where students are not learning in the way we think they are anymore.
And certainly not for the joy of it if they're really grade motivated.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a lot of what the data suggests, is that the degree of grade motivation we see means they're not learning it or not enjoying learning and so on. But the problem is, how does Yale change, right? Yale wants to increase, obviously, its well-being, right? It wants to decrease mental health crises on our campus. But they don't want to be less selective. They don't want to be less selective than last year. And I think the same is true in high schools. High schools obviously want their students to sleep more.
Yeah.
They don't want to reduce the number of students who get into places like Yale and Harvard and Princeton and so on. And so I think we're really in this awful arms race of accolades and all these things that we're going after that we're miswanting that aren't going to make us as happy as we think. And honestly, I'm not sure how we get out of it.
I wonder how much of it has to do with scarcity. There are only so many slots at Yale.
Yep.
And now it's become a global brand. It's like the art market, and you see suddenly paintings going for $100 million. When you see apartments on particular blocks going for $100 million, maybe the equivalent of it costs $100 million to get into a school like Yale is just this incredible sacrifice of your youth.
I think that's right. As I said, I think we're just in this awful arms race where I'm not sure how we get out. I don't see universities changing. There's a world where universities could turn to something like a lottery system where, and they should, in the sense that they know they could admit 2 to 3 times the class and not decrease on any metric of success or SAT scores or things.
So they would say, we admit 6,000 students. You made the cut. Fabulous. There's a high bar.
Be a high bar, but not as crazy.
Yeah,
as
it's a high bar. And now of those people who made the cut, which you can make without killing yourself.
Right, because the cut is like many thousands of people who make the first cut, right? Yeah.
Then from that, it's a lottery. That's interesting.
So that's one possibility. But I actually think the change is going to come from lower. I think there's going to be a real revolution. And I think this because when I talk to high school students, they instantly get it. They're like, wait, you're telling me all this stuff that my society has taught me, like salary, grades, all this stuff, it's not going to matter. I'm killing myself. I'm watching friends of mine get mental health disorders, and it's not going to matter. WTF. They haven't been in the game for as long as many of us have, so they see it faster. And I also think that they have the power of collective action, that they could link up together. And
go on strike.
Really, I mean, if there was just a labor riot of these students at elite schools, if every student in elite high school said, we're not taking the SAT this year, or we're all backtracking, we're all going to sleep 10 hours, let the chips fall where they may, elite institutions would have to do something. And I think with Parkland and with all these cases of student activists, they use the power of social media for some good things, one of which is collective action on this stuff. So that's my hope, is that we can have a labor revolution in our young people.
Well, it's hard because if you try to fix it at the university level, there's a danger of falling into cartel-like behavior.
That's right.
Because if you did say, okay, look, there are these 15 schools, 20 schools, 100, however you draw the lines, that group is sort of the problem, and they could collectively fix it by doing something like what they do in medical school,
right,
where if you make the cut, you're told where you're going to go, and somebody might have their heart set on Yale and end up at Princeton or Williams or Amherst or whatever, but it's still a great school.
Yep.
Yeah, but then that becomes very cartel-like. And then if you try to get the student strike where we're just not going to take it anymore, you're going to have a defector or 10 or 100 who is going to take the SAT and they're going to crush it. And they're going to be the ones that get in. So it's tricky, but unearthing these practices, the 25 years of progress that we've had, really understanding the cognitive science of happiness better, the work that you're doing, which is suddenly getting an enormous platform, people spreading that word, those are very, very powerful forces that all the technology that can cause misery and does cause misery has the opposite effect of amplifying. So
irony there, yeah.
There's an irony, but there's tremendous hope there as well. And there's tremendous potential there. So thank you for letting me contribute to your time impoverishment today and for welcoming Ashby the dog in today. It was nice to be able to sit on the train with her and come out here and visit you with her. And for everything that you've done, it's really kind of an amazing edifice that you're starting to build here.
Thanks so much.
So, may some of those amazing insights and practices bring a little, or hopefully even a lot, more happiness to all of you who decide to make a little room for them in your schedules. And in case we've overcorrected and you're a little too happy right now, I may have the antidote. Just head on over to my page at medium.com. You need the @ symbol for the URL. So it's medium.com/ then @ symbol, then Rob Reid, ROBREID. Sorry, it's a slightly complicated URL. There you'll find the opening installments of a 4-part essay that I've written, which is called Privatizing the Apocalypse. At least 2 and possibly 3 of the installments should be there by the time you hear this. These are my careful speculations on things that could go wrong with the otherwise wildly promising technologies that humanity is developing at exponential speeds in this century. As you should know by now, I tend to be a relentless optimist when it comes to science and technology and their potential to better our lives, but there are terrible risks looming on the horizon. I'm optimistic enough to believe that if we start thinking hard about them now, we could dodge several terrifying bullets. We've already done this once, after all, by escaping the Cold War without a single nuke being dropped. Nuclear weapons remain a problem, obviously, and the risk of a regional nuclear war could be higher than ever as a result of their proliferation to India, Pakistan, and North Korea since the end of the Cold War. But at least for now, the threat of an all-out civilization-canceling nuclear war between superpowers has diminished since the fall of the Soviet Union. That's the good news. The bad news is that some of the technologies I enthuse about the most on this show, for instance, synthetic biology and artificial intelligence, could do us devastating harm in the wrong hands. Now, because I'm an optimist, I don't believe this is inevitable. But since I'm also a realist, I know of all too many plausible scenarios in which humanity could quite literally meet its end. And I wish that was a melodramatic exaggeration, but I neither think nor talk in terms of negative hyperbole, as I believe regular listeners to this show will attest. And it gets worse. Unless we start taking some very sober, proactive, precautionary steps now, I believe we're unlikely to make it to New Year's Eve of 2099. My reasons for all this will be laid out in the 4 installments of my Medium essay, as will certain core elements of my optimism. So there's a bit of a plot twist in there. An extended version of my conversation with Laurie is available to those who support my podcast at a level of $5 a month or more. That version is something like 40% longer than the main version. If you join at the $5 level, you'll unlock this and many other hours of extra Patreon-only bonus content. I add to that archive every time I post a new episode. Sometimes it's an extended version of the interview from the main feed like today, and sometimes it's an entirely freestanding mini episode, which in some way expands on the main episode. My Patreon backers are currently this show's only source of economic support because I don't yet have ads. I'm not part of NPR or any podcast network. So thank you again, patrons, for making this possible. If you're not financially able or just not inclined to back the show financially, you can still help it a lot by spreading the word about it. For each episode, I post a very self-contained tweet, which carefully describes the current show, and the Laurie Santos tweet is already up in my feed at twitter.com/Rob_Reed. So please consider helping the show out by helping it to light up some new neurons that are out there by forwarding these little synopses around. Most of my episodes are only retweeted a few dozen times, actually, so I absolutely notice and deeply appreciate all relevant activity on Twitter. The last and most simple, easy, time-efficient, and free thing you can do to help this show and expand its audience is to rate it on iTunes or in Apple's Podcasts app. Both of these apps, frankly, have rather squirrely UIs, but if you've made it through today's episode or any of my episodes, you are definitely smart enough to figure it out, I promise. These ratings matter to Apple's promotional algorithm and therefore really do help the show expand. That's it for now. I hope to see you when my next episode comes up in a couple of weeks. If I'm a little bit slow about posting things, it is because of the recent passing of my father. And also I've got this stuff going on Medium. So thank you for your patience.